In this video, we dive into one of the greatest scientific rivalries in history between Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. In January 2021, the French Institut Pasteur announced ceasing the production of its COVID-19 vaccine because it had disappointing results, my friend. You might find it quite logical to do this, my friend, since the world was still learning about COVID-19 at that time. However, French politicians described it as national humiliation. The Guardian said that this was a hit to the French self-esteem. They only canceled a vaccine, not lost a war. The problem, my friend, is that such news came from an institute that carries the name of Louis Pasteur, who was more than a scientist to the French people. They considered him to be a genius who used his scientific expertise to win a political race that made France the greatest country of its age, as it defeated its enemies and developed vaccines to fatal diseases during a time when governments were still thinking. When France, specifically Institut Pasteur, failed to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, it was considered as a national disgrace, not a mere failed scientific experiment. The French politician Bastien Lachaud summed up how the French felt when he said, he meant that it's symbolic how... Let's go to mid-19th century, my friend. Sounds good? The European scientific community had one question: what is the origin of life? The most famous theory that answered that question was called spontaneous generation. Living organisms are born out of non-living, inanimate objects, so if you leave a piece of meat in the air, you'll come back to find it full of worms. Some scientists thought that this was enough proof for the theory. Others thought that this wasn't logical. The Paris Academy of Sciences offered an award to whoever can settle this debate. A scientist appeared and said that all of this talk would lead to nothing, and that they should try different experiments in labs. That's where Louis Pasteur's role shines. He got 2 swan neck flasks like the ones you can see on the screen. He put soup in both flasks. Pasteur sterilized and boiled both flasks, and he closed one and left the other open. Pasteur said that if the theory of spontaneous generation was correct, mold would appear in the closed flask and the opened one. Since soup was inanimate, it was supposed to form mold in both flasks. Surprise, my friend. It was a surprise to them back then, not to us now. Mold appeared in the opened flask only. This means that meat by itself won't produce worms, but meat with some air that contains worm larvae or worms that laid larvae in the meat will produce worms. If we seal that meat, it won't produce any worms. That's what happened in the second flask. The soup was fine. Pasteur proved that this had nothing to do with spontaneous generation. Can a living organism come from an inanimate object? No. This paved the way for a theory called the germ theory. It might sound like a bunch of nerds who were experimenting in labs trying to answer philosophical questions, but let me tell you that this experiment saved the French Empire from bankruptcy. Let's go back in time a little further, my friend. In 1863, the wine industry was the leading industry in France and its main export to Europe. It got affected by wine diseases, which ruined the wine taste. Emperor Napoleon III called for Pasteur, telling him to find a solution as the wine was going bad. Pasteur worked for 2 years and finally took his microscope to show the emperor and the empress the microscopic creatures he discovered. These creatures interfered with the fermentation process and ruined the wine. He told them that the solution was to boil the wine at 55 degrees Celsius, which is the process of pasteurization. Now you know its origin. We do this process to milk and many other liquids to get rid of the germs in it. Not only did Pasteur save the wine industry, but also saved the silk industry in France, Europe, and Asia. Silkworms were infected with fatal diseases. Pasteur discovered that these worms were infected with nosema, which was an infectious genetic disease. Through analysis, Pasteur discovered that nosema appears as shiny particles. He separated female worms from the rest, and after every worm laid its eggs, he checked the worm. If he found shiny particles in the worm, he would destroy its eggs. It was as if Pasteur was choosing the founding species. Pasteur turned into a national hero who saved the economy of France and Europe itself. At the same time, other scientists thought it was strange. It's expected that when we mention things like germs, species, microscopes, separating the eggs, genetics, and boiling at exactly 55 degrees Celsius, You'd think that Pasteur was a biologist or a doctor. In fact, Pasteur was a chemist who was doing experiments in a field that was unrelated to his. This was an obstacle in his life. Many scientists refused his theories, even though they were successful, just because Pasteur was a chemist and not a doctor. Pasteur always said no such thing as pure science, only science and application of science.
This was apparent in his personality as a person who started experiments and applications to solve a problem he saw.
Pasteur was given the Legion of Honor. Since he fixed the problem with the emperor's beloved wine, the emperor built him a huge lab to proceed with his research, and they would send him any wine that had a problem. Up until now, Pasteur had a good life and was an honor to his country.
Suddenly, the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, my friend. The war ended with the humiliation of France and the surrender of Napoleon III, who was the one supporting Pasteur. Therefore, Pasteur lost his lab and the title of a national hero and went back to the starting point.
Pasteur dedicated his life to defeating one enemy, not germs or microbes, but the Germans who humiliated his country. In 1871, Pasteur returned an honorary degree that the German Bonn University sent him.
I don't want it, you can have it.
He also stapled a letter to it in which he disrespected Germany. He was fermenting an idea in his mind, my friend, the best idea for revenge from the Germans.
He built an army out of the small creatures he found under the microscope, so he had a big army of small creatures. And then he invaded Germany, right?
No, my friend, he actually made a beer.
What? Was he trying to serve revenge or drinks to the Germans?
My dear viewer, let me explain to you that he attacked them economically.
How?
Beer was a German basic commodity, on which Germany depended in exports. After Germany invaded Alsace and Lorraine, which were France's wine industry hold, they took over the whole industry and had no competitors. Let me tell you that the Germans were having a hard time with beer production. They stored it at low temperatures in basements for the whole winter to preserve it. Pasteur knew very well that they had problems with germs. He invented a beer and applied his methods to it and was easier to manufacture. He named it the beer of revenge. It's known as the glass of revenge in Egyptian bars. Pasteur presented his studies in the book Studies on Beer, and his beer took over Europe. Pasteur was watching everything and enjoying his revenge as beer production evolved everywhere in Europe except in Germany because he rejected for his book to be translated to German.
Whoever wants the beer recipe, come to the Cultural French Bar.
Are you sure he said it like that?
Yes, my friend, according to the sources, he also did this. What Pasteur did turned him into a rock star in a country that was humiliated and needed an idol.
We lost the war, were humiliated, and they took over our lands. But thanks God the Germans don't have our beer recipe. It's written in a book that all of Europe can read and use, but they can't. The little victories that count.
Jokes aside, my friend, let me tell you that this was just the start. While Pasteur was lost in his beer with its small creatures swimming in it, he became obsessed with one question. What if the diseases that resided in humans' and animals' bodies were mere germs swimming in blood, just like the ones that swim in beers?
Pasteur did the best career shift he could have ever done. He left chemistry and pasteurization and joined the field of bacteriology and became one of its greatest pioneers.
Thank God I was worried about him. I mean, he started working on wine, then beer. Who knew what was next? Finally, he was focused on something better and forgot about Germany.
My friend, we're on the foot of a war between two major countries, a war between France and Germany that was more violent than world wars. At that time, Pasteur was over 50 years old and had a stroke previously that paralyzed his left hand. He was an old man shifting his career, however. He had an idea that completely changed how we look at medicine.
What Pasteur didn't know was that someone would appear and change everything. At about 1,000 kilometers away from Pasteur, in the rural city of Wolstein, Robert Koch, a German teenager, appeared and was 21 years younger than Pasteur. But he had the same idea as Pasteur. In 1873, Koch was surprised by the wave of anthrax epidemic that took his city by storm, and all the cattle would get tumors, followed by black blood, then a horrifying death.
Koch was a rural doctor who wasn't in a position like Pasteur's. Even scientific communities didn't know about him. He was basically Mr. Nobody.
Koch forgot about this and divided his clinic into two parts using a curtain. He used one part to help patients and used the other as a primitive lab with only a microscope that his wife got him as a present.
When he was busy with his research, his wife would let patients go so that he could focus.
Koch studied the blood of infected sheep, and he found particles like the ones on the screen. Koch needed to see the particles moving and reproducing to prove that it was causing the disease. He searched for a mediator that would accept such bacteria. According to the immunologist, Stefan Kaufmann, Koch managed to find that mediator in the oxeye. Why though? Was it for a medical reason, or was the ox the only animal that agreed to participate? No, my friend, the oxeye was special, as it contains a disinfectant fluid full of nutritional substances. Bacteria can reproduce and grow in it as well. Koch created a healthy culture of bacteria, and he injected the new bacteria into healthy animals, like rabbits and sheep. Later, these healthy animals developed the symptoms of anthrax. To make sure, he isolated the bacteria and repeated the same process in 20 generations of rats. This created what's known as Koch's postulates. 1. The microbe must be found in an infected animal. 2. The microbe must be isolated in a culture. 3. The microbe must be injected in a healthy animal, so it becomes infected. 4. The microbe must be isolated again to turn out to be just like the original. Do you get it? The idea that germs cause diseases was something new and wasn't understandable. People thought that they got ill by coincidence. Koch was trying to explain that germs cause diseases. To prove this, we need to isolate the germ from the infected body and put it in a suitable place for reproduction and growth, like the oxeye, as it was a suitable environment for preserving germs. Then, we need to inject these germs in a healthy body of another animal. And when the animal starts to develop the disease, we'll isolate that microbe to find that it was just like the original one. Therefore, this microbe is the one responsible for that disease. Koch's postulates became a tool to identify epidemics that is used till today. He basically put the basics. Now you know why your mother would say, "Let it gotch, you'll catch germs." Koch didn't know that someone would appear and change everything again. In 1876, Louis Pasteur was minding his own business, eating a croissant, and was surprised by a research paper by a rural doctor, which connected specific bacteria to a specific disease for the first time. He found the first practical evidence to his germ theory, which he had put forward years ago. Pasteur went crazy as the most important theory in his life was proved by a younger unknown doctor from a rural place who was also German in Prussia. He didn't even reference the efforts of Louis Pasteur and his germ theory, the theory which Koch couldn't have connected bacteria to anything without it. Up until now, we're witnessing a logical scientific jealousy. Pasteur found out that Koch wasn't just an ordinary German. Koch served in the Franco-Prussian War against France. Let me tell you, my friend, that Koch was exempted from military service due to his short-sightedness. However, he volunteered as a military physician. Pasteur considered him to be a fanatic German. In 1878, Pasteur started conducting his own research on anthrax so that France could keep up with Germany. Both Pasteur and Koch noticed that anthrax spread in specific fields in Europe. These fields were called the cursed fields, as any animal that visited it would contact anthrax. Pasteur and Koch discovered that the bacteria of anthrax releases spores in hard conditions as a thick wall that surrounds the bacteria to protect itself from heat and humidity and help it remain in the soil. Since farmers bury dead animals in the fields, therefore, the worms feed on the corpse and take these spores to the surface. If it rains or if an animal eats the grass, the spores will burst. That's why Koch ordered farmers to burn dead animals. Pasteur published new research about anthrax between 1878 and 1880. Koch noticed that the Frenchman didn't reference him in his research as well. Koch said, "I'm the one who discovered the life cycle of anthrax, and I'm the one who proved the germ theory." Pasteur only referenced him in a small footnote as if he was one of the germs they were working on. A historical grudge emerged at that moment between a German school and a French school, Pasteur versus Koch. Each one had a country supporting him. Any discovery by any of them was considered a victory, not for them, but for his country on the other country. Both schools weren't just from different countries, but also of different ideologies. According to Koch and the German school, the microbes isolated in cultures don't change characteristics. Therefore, there is no option other than discovering the bacteria of any disease and trying to protect ourselves from it. Just like what Koch did when he ordered the burning of corpses because of spores as a preventive solution against a microbe that keeps its characteristics. Pasteur in the French school said that the microbe has virulence, which is a severity that can increase or decrease. If this severity decreases, the microbe will become weaker and its characteristics will change. That's when they can find a cure that kills it, or it could be the cure to itself. Pasteur reached this result through his experiments on chicken cholera caused by the Pasteurella bacteria. Pasteur discovered that when the bacteria samples were exposed to air for a long period without any surrounding conditions to help it grow, the bacteria became weaker. When a chicken was injected with the weak bacteria, then with the normal bacteria, the chicken didn't die. If we can weaken the bacteria, one way or another, we can turn it into a vaccine. No, my friend, it was Edward Jenner. He reached the idea decades before Pasteur. How? Jenner was the first person to inject smallpox patients with a bacterial sample of cowpox, and that was the first vaccine in human history. Jenner didn't even understand the process or how it happened. Pasteur was the first person to explain why Jenner's experiment succeeded. That's why historians say, Pasteur said that if the microbe has variable characteristics and we can weaken it, then we can make a vaccine for any disease. That's what eternally distinguished Pasteur and Koch's journey. Koch focused on prevention, cleanliness, and all methods of preventing the microbe from entering the body. Pasteur focused on what's after. He always focused on the cure. That was probably because he lost 3 out of his 5 children to typhoid. He knew what it felt like to not find a cure to your disease. Pasteur was challenged to do experiments on anthrax, the one he was teasing Germany about. In the spring of 1881, a bet was waged in public in the city of Pouilly-le-Fort. Pasteur and his team weakened the anthrax bacteria by putting it in an oxygen-rich medium at a temperature that prevents the formation of spores that protect the bacteria. They also added carbolic acid. They brought 70 sheep and injected half of them with the weak bacteria, or the vaccine. Then, they injected all the sheep with the original strong bacteria. According to Patrick Birch, the president of Institut Pasteur, Pasteur risked his reputation and all of his achievements. He was risking everything with an uncertain experiment. He didn't know if his vaccine concept was right, even if it was correct. He didn't know if his method was correct or if it would affect anthrax. Pasteur was risking all of this in front of 200 watchers, including politicians, farmers, journalists, and more. All of them witnessed the howling success of his experiment. The sheep that were vaccinated with the weak bacteria lived, while the rest died. During the 7th International Medical Congress, held in London in 1881, Pasteur and Koch met for the first time. Koch, who discovered the anthrax bacteria, saw that everyone forgot about him and celebrated with Pasteur for discovering the cure of anthrax. At that time, Koch had just finished research about the isolation and pigmentation of bacteria, but Pasteur took all the glory. After the Congress, Koch defamed Pasteur and accused him of inaccurate samples and experiments. Honestly, I think Koch was a bad loser. Pasteur came up with a vaccine while Koch was working on pigmentation as if he was a hairstylist. Didn't I tell you to have some patience, my friend? Rome wasn't built in a day, so please have some patience. Using the pigment you were joking about, Koch discovered epidemics that were far more dangerous than anthrax. I'll explain. Koch and his school were convinced that, since microbes didn't change their characteristics and were hard to cure, it was better to work on hunting them. They had to develop the microscopes and the methods they used to research bacteria, specifically the artificial environment where they cultivated the bacteria. The reason Koch's research on anthrax succeeded was that he was able to find a mediator like the fluid in the ox eyes. This was a suitable place for bacteria to grow in. Unfortunately, it wasn't suitable for all kinds of bacteria. Also, when the bacteria entered the fluid, it got mixed up with other types, which led to the sample losing its purity. Koch reached the idea of the plate technique, which meant that we can create cultures of bacteria on a hard surface. He tried out many hard surfaces, like potatoes and other substances, until he tried in gelatine. When cooled, it forms a perfect, pure culture for most bacteria types. Scientists were convinced that all types of bacteria have the same shape and color, but Koch wasn't. For example, some bacteria are transparent and can only be seen using pigments. Koch used pigments like safranine and methyl violet to improve lighting under the microscope so that he can see all types of bacteria. At the end of the 19th century, the most dangerous epidemic of history appeared, which wasn't anthrax, it was tuberculosis, the White Death. Let me tell you that 70 to 90% of the urban population in Europe and Northern America had tuberculosis. About 80% of patients of active tuberculosis died. Everybody knew how dangerous it was, but no one could catch its bacteria because it resisted all types of pigments, to the point where people were convinced that it was a genetic disease and wasn't caused by any bacteria, as they couldn't find it. Koch used the methylene blue stain pigment, which was made by Paul Ehrlich, to reveal the presence of rod-like particles in the patient's tissues. However, it still wasn't clear. He tried adding a brown pigment to create a contrast that reveals it in pictures, and he discovered something terrible. Tubercle bacillus appear at first, but are covered later by tubercula in the tissues. Koch tested 217 animals. In March 1882, he prepared 200 microscopic samples in what was described as one of the greatest presentations in medical history. In the same year, Koch met Pasteur in the International Congress of Hygiene and Demography in Geneva. Koch. Remember when you took all the credit and success? Oh, how the table turns, Mr. Pasteur. A complete turnaround happened, my friend, and Koch was the star of the Congress. Everyone such amazing pigments, Koch. Koch was the star as the one who discovered the epidemic of the century, while Pasteur was like a ghost in the background. The world was surprised with what happened at the Congress. Pasteur went up the rostrum and lambasted Koch, who was in the front row, because Koch questioned his experiment previously. In a letter Pasteur sent to his assistant Émile Roux, he said that his speech smeared Koch badly. Take care that Koch wasn't a tactful speaker like Pasteur. Pasteur was of high class and was friends with Napoleon III, who built Pasteur his own lab after the wine problem. He was a respected gentleman and speaker. Meanwhile, Koch was only a rural doctor with a very small lab that was separated from his clinic with a curtain. It was very limited, my friend. This made Pasteur defeat him in the vocal battle, and Koch couldn't talk back while Pasteur was stealing his joy at the Congress. This was the last time Pasteur would meet Koch, and the last time Koch would meet Pasteur, of course. However, this wasn't the final round in their battle. In a letter, Koch said the sentence Pasteur hated the most. It really hurt him from the beginning of the episode, Koch said. Pasteur is not even a physician, as if Pasteur was an intruder to the field. This sentence would hurt anyone, my friend. My grades in school stopped me. I actually work behind the cashier in a pharmacy, and people call me doctor. What Koch said about Pasteur led to a violent final round in their battle, which took place in the least expected place, Egypt. In the summer of 1883, cholera threatened Europe because it spread in Europe's colonies like Egypt and India. Cholera became the subject of a political conflict between Germany and France. Germany sent a delegation led by Koch. Because Pasteur was too old for such a trip, under his supervision, France sent a delegation led by his student Émile Roux. Both delegations arrived to a horrible situation. The epidemic killed 500 people daily. Even though the French delegation had preventive measures, it lost Louis Tuillier, who was a young scientist and one of Pasteur's excellent students. This was a humane moment amid a competitive battle. Even though Louis was one of Koch's worst enemies, and Louis described Koch as the hated rural guy, when Louis died, Koch visited his grave. A really nice move that I respect Koch for. My friend, Koch went to Louis' grave, the one who called him names, and laid wreaths of flowers. He said that it was laurel wreaths, like the ones that were laid at the graves of victorious soldiers. This was the moment when both delegations remembered that, outside this political grudge, they were noble doctors, standing in the face of a fierce epidemic, with the aim of saving millions of people. Tuillier was the one to remind them that they had the same enemy and the same aim. Why were they fighting? After the epidemic diminished in Egypt, the French delegation left 2 months later. However, Koch didn't give up, and his passion made him take his team to Kolkata, India, where the epidemic was at its peak. Koch discovered comma-shaped bacteria in the patient's intestines. As usual, he needed to prove the relation between the bacteria and the disease. He wanted to answer an important question: why did cholera spread in specific focal points like Egypt and India? Koch discovered that cholera bacteria become active in river deltas, like the Nile and the Ganges. What happened is that people threw their trash in the river, then they would drink and wash their clothes in the same river, so they would get cholera. When Koch's team analyzed the water tanks and the clothes, they found the bacteria. Koch immediately ordered the disinfection of water in Kolkata. He carried his ideas about the disinfection of water to Europe as a main method to avoid cholera. Actually, my friend, Koch discovered the two most important epidemics in the 19th century, cholera and tuberculosis. Pasteur saw that the unknown rural doctor was changing into a professor of hygiene at Berlin University and was honored by the German Chancellor Bismarck. Bismarck was the one who destroyed Pasteur's home country. We mentioned it in the episode about him. Pasteur found out that he needed to make a comeback, a clever comeback in his country. Koch became the king of discoveries, and Pasteur needed to return as the king of cures. Pasteur decided to make his comeback by making a cure for rabies. Fear of water. Remember the 21-shot vaccine? Why didn't he make a vaccine for a more important disease? Why didn't he make one for tuberculosis or cholera or joint pain? Pasteur followed his passion, my friend. He was impressed by rabies because the dog bite heals normally, but the disease starts an incubation period of up to 3 months in the body. Horrifying symptoms appear that could lead to death, like spasms and hallucinations. Not only can we make a vaccine for prevention, but also we can inject it during the long incubation period, after the infection. This concept is known as post-infection prophylaxis. The problem was that Pasteur was dealing with viruses and not bacteria, as viruses are much smaller than bacteria. Back then, the electron microscope didn't exist yet, which can sometimes show viruses. The method used to weaken the microbe, to make a vaccine out of it, had to be changed. Pasteur injected the brains of the animals and dried its spinal cords to weaken the microbe. Such experiments required years, while Pasteur was in his 60s and not as tolerant. He didn't know if he would live long enough to see the vaccine. One of Pasteur's famous quotes says, "Fortune favors prepared minds." That fortune arrived in July 1885, when Pasteur's clinic had a patient named Joseph Meister, who was a kid that got bit by a rabid dog, and his mother begged Pasteur to cure him. Pasteur tried to tell her that his experiments weren't confirmed and were conducted on animals only. However, the mother told him that he was going to die either way, so it was better to try. "Pasteur, don't cry, Mom, I'll handle it." However, Pasteur took the risk as usual, my friend. He remembered his kids who died of typhoid when he was trying to find any possible method to cure them. He saw Joseph as one of his kids. Joseph was given 12 shots of the weak microbe, but the 13th shot contained the strong microbe, which was the hardest element in the experiment. After Pasteur gave him the shots, he waited for the results. His career was at stake. His entire history could be wiped out if the experiment went wrong or something happened to the kid. His career would be wrecked if the experiment failed and the kid died. Even though the kid was going to die at first, people still had high expectations. Actually, Joseph was cured, my friend. What? Yes, my friend, Joseph was cured of rabies because of Pasteur. Pasteur turned into some kind of tourist destination. Patients with rabies visited him from all around Europe to be cured by him. What a comeback, Pasteur. I keep telling my mom that if I started working in beer and wine, I'll cure kids at the end. Pasteur died 10 years later. Sometime before his death, he refused an honoring sent from Prussia to assert in his final moments that he spent his life serving France. On the other hand, Koch gave Germany its major source of pride when he won a Nobel Prize in 1905 for discovering the tuberculosis bacteria. This war didn't end with the death or retirement of either Pasteur or Koch, but it even continued between the students of both, who were named the microbe hunters. In 1894, Alexander Yersin discovered the bacteria of Yersinia pestis, a type of plague bacteria. Alexander was a student of the French school, and his rival was Kitasato Shibasaburo. A Japanese student of Koch's German school of prevention is better than the cure. The efforts of Koch and his students from 1876 to 1906 changed the state of humanity from doubting the existence of germs to discovering the causing bacteria of most diseases. The picture on the screen is proof. It's a picture of all the diseases discovered by Koch and his students. If you think that these are old diseases, let me tell you that Pasteur's concepts about the change in the severity and characteristics of microbes are the basis of studying newer viruses like AIDS and SARS. Pasteur predicted that humanity will face worse diseases in the future if his concept was correct, as some microbes will be able to change their characteristics and infect humans. We'll move to 2020. I get it, no need to. No, let's go to 2020. We witnessed this in newer epidemics. Not exactly, my friend, as thousands died because of their grudge. Let me tell you that the vaccine of rabies was accepted in Germany very late because it was invented by Pasteur, and they didn't want any French vaccines. The plate technique was accepted very late in France as well because it was invented by Koch, and they didn't want any German plates. Every country was late because it refused the enemy's achievements. After Pasteur developed the rabies vaccine, the German government pushed Koch to announce that he discovered a vaccine for tuberculosis. They told him, "You only discover the diseases, you disappear and come back warning us of a new disease and to take measures. No more of this, we want cures now." Opposite to his usual habit of confirming his results, Koch announced the discovery of tuberculin. Millions went to Berlin hoping to get cured, but the cure failed and had catastrophic results because it wasn't tested thoroughly. Many of humanity's achievements were created through a number of famous grudges, like the ones between Edison and Tesla, and the one between Newton and Hooke. What's interesting about Koch and Pasteur's grudge was that it was between two countries, and it happened because of a war that occurred due to a syntax error. In the Bismarck episode, we talked about the Ems dispatch, the letter where Bismarck changed the structure of a single word to be a diplomatic insult that would force France to fight Germany in the war. What's also interesting is that a study in 2007 revealed that part of their grudge was because of syntax errors, or simply because Pasteur and Koch didn't speak the same language. Many people were convinced that Koch didn't reference Pasteur in his anthrax research because he didn't know French. During the London conference, where both first met, Pasteur set his pride aside and recognized Koch's isolation research. However, the difference in language stood in their way of understanding each other. According to the study, during the Geneva Congress, Pasteur said Recueil allemand, which meant the collected works of Koch, while the professor Ludwig Lichtheim, Koch's simultaneous French interpreter, interpreted it to Orgueil allemand, which meant the German arrogance. That's what made Koch envy and hate Pasteur. It's interesting that two of humanity's greatest minds discovered and fought creatures that can only be seen using a microscope, and were united in proving the existence of microbes that were denied by older science. But they were divided by political conflicts and language barriers, things that don't require a microscope to see the danger of. More than a century after Koch and Pasteur's grudge, COVID-19 hit the world. Creating the vaccine became a competition between countries for political glory. Just like how this was a motive to work faster on the vaccine, it was a hidden mean of excelling. For example, when the European Commission announced, in the beginning of 2021, applying controlling mechanisms on exporting the vaccines created in the EU. This led to many territorial tensions. According to Rika Harris, professor of politics in the University of Liverpool, countries give us a sense of security and belonging, but viruses don't recognize countries. COVID-19 didn't need a passport to enter the US. Pasteur and Koch will remain local symbols for their countries, what both wanted. However, with time, Pasteur's discoveries will save millions of Germans, and Koch's discoveries will save millions of French people. This will immortalize them in the legacy of human medicine, which breaks all borders. In fact, this is a much greater ending than the outcome of their narrow grudge. Check the sources below and subscribe if you're on YouTube.